Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining us today. Our broadcast will begin in approximately 6 minutes. And welcome to the NESIS webinar titled Coaching Teachers Using Teacher-Led Conferences. If you are attending by phone, we have some directions for you on the screen. If you can hear the sound of my voice, your settings should be okay for today's session. If you would, please signify your audio is working by raising your hand on the dashboard beside your name. Thank you. So again, thank you for joining us today for our webinar. I am joined by Heather Stewart, Professional Development Coordinator for Educator Support Services, and we also have Delia Payne from Educator Support Services on the line with us. These ladies will be monitoring the chat and questions bar for us and letting me know if there are needs for clarification or for some extended conversation. Also, if you have technical difficulties, you can raise your hand and these ladies will assist you. Our webinar norms for today, we ask that you minimize your outside distractions, be attentive and participate, notify the presenter if you are having technical difficulties by raising your hand, and please use the questions bar on your dashboard to ask questions. Our webinar objectives today: build skills for coaching teachers with a teacher-led conversation using low-inference data, and also to examine a framework for supporting teacher-led conferences. Please note that you have two handouts provided in the handout section of this webinar. One is the questions document for post-observation conferences and summative evaluations, and the second one is putting it all together checklist for teacher-led conversations. So let's begin with this scenario. If you'll follow along while I read. Imagine that a principal hands a teacher a scored rubric, summarizes the rationale behind each rating, and asks the teacher if he or she has any questions. Technically, the principal has fulfilled his duty and complied with the state regulations. But did the principal provide feedback that would result in better teaching and increasing learning? And I think that we can all read this scenario. I know that I can read this, and as a new principal, I can relate to it because I feel like this is probably how I operated at the very beginning. I would go in, observe a teacher, then speak with the teacher afterwards during a post-observation conference and summarize what I saw, justify my ratings, and we were good. But we have a new way of coaching our teachers using our evaluation process, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So again, thank you for being with us. So now let's move on and get some of your input. I'd like for you to respond in text to NC 2015. I would like for you to text 37607 to NC 2015. Wants to join our poll everywhere, and then you'll get an alert message saying that you have successfully joined. And I'd like for you to respond to this question: what makes post-observation and summative evaluation conversations difficult for principals to have with teachers? So we're going to take a few minutes so we can get some good feedback from you guys in the field on why these conversations are so difficult to have with teachers. And I entered one just to test our poll everywhere about 41 minutes ago, and I commented there's not enough time to dig deep into a conversation. So we'll be anxious to hear what some of your responses may be. Okay, we have some coming in. Another comment, the teacher feels they should get higher ratings. Yes, and we tend to avoid those conversations because we may feel differently. And teachers that have received higher ratings for years past, and all of a sudden you are a new principal, they feel like they should continue to get those higher ratings. Definitely don't have extensive content knowledge for some high school classes. Yes, another good comment. And we will talk a little bit during our presentation today about how we can bridge some of that content knowledge by using some of the specialists within our schools. Not sure what it should look like in the classroom with technology. Okay. That's not a part of today's conversation, but I will say while we're waiting on other comments to come in that looking at students and their use of technology in the classroom should be your first focus. It's really just a developing or a proficient teacher uses technology to deliver or to facilitate instruction, and you kind of cross over to accomplished and distinguished when we see students using the technology in the classroom, if that provides any clarification. Other comments coming in, teachers think they should have a different rating than the principal does. It's hard to reconcile the observations sometimes. Yes, and we often find that during those conversations that we damage the relationship that we have with the teachers just because we differ in opinions. And it is a very biased process. That is why we need to really use the language of the rubric and the indicators that are provided for us in the rubric. And we'll discuss that a bit more throughout the webinar. Time to get and give help. Yes, time is always a factor. So we'll wait about one more minute and then we will move on. But great responses, and thank you so much for participating. Oh, I see another one I didn't read. Teachers only want to focus on behavior. Okay. The conversations need to be positive way and support the teacher's work. Yes. I agree. Okay. Sometimes I have to back out to, there's no real feedback. Okay, that's an interesting comment. Okay, so let's begin our session for today by looking at the 3 C's of feedback conversation: coaching, collaborating, and consulting. So let's examine the visual on the screen. Consider the small oval to the left as the action entering the conversation and the small oval to the right as the exit of the conversation. When having a feedback conversation, it is important to be a coach as you enter and a coach as you exit. So now let's take a look at what types of conversations we have in the large circle. This is during the body of the conversation, the 3 C's of feedback. Again, and of course, we begin the conversation by coaching. We assess the conversation and decide if we need to provide more support. If we do, then we drop down to collaborating. Again, we assess the conversation, deciding if we need to support even more by consulting. So let's look at these 3 C's a little bit closer and look at the roles that we have. So here are our feedback roles defined. Coaching. If you are coaching, you are a thought partner. You may be providing resources and ideas. As a colleague role in supporting the collaborating, you're a co-planner. Even though you're still in the principal's role, you're really working with this teacher as a colleague. You are co-planning. You are solving problems and you are clarifying. And then as the consultant, you are the expert. You would provide advice, rationale, and actually demonstrations of what you think would improve the lesson that you observed. So I go from being a coach to a collaborator to a consultant, depending on the need of my teacher. So now let's look at the 3 different C's of feedback even a bit closer. We have our role defined and what that means, but coaching. What do I do during the coaching time? It's very important to remember that this is a non-directive conversation and that it's self-directed by the teacher. We want the teacher to lead as much of the coaching conversation as they can, just like when, let's compare it to a basketball game and the coach. The players are playing, they are leading the game, and you are coaching them. The teacher is the primary source of information and analysis. Collaborating. During the collaborating part of feedback, we do more than coaching. We go into sharing ideas, sharing our thinking, and sharing our resources. We practice purposeful pausing and paraphrasing, and we still are resisting the impulse to lead the conversation. We want to empower the teacher-directed contribution. Now for consulting. This role is different than the other 2. The other 2, between coaching and collaborating, they are very similar. But the consulting, you have a different approach there. You are offering your expertise to another. You are providing information, identifying and analyzing gaps, and you're suggesting solutions. And we ask that you consider thinking aloud about the cause and effect relationships and make connections to principles of practice. Consulting continued provides essential information about learning and learners, curriculum and content, policy, standards, and effective practices in ways that are immediately useful and builds capacity. And also our thinking is transparent. And when I was first reading the research on the 3 C's of feedback, the thinking is transparent. I really wanted to dig a little bit into that. The thinking is transparent here because you want to model how a teacher would problem solve and how they would identify what essential information or curriculum or content or policy or standard would be beneficial and how that they would actually utilize that information. So your thinking is transparent to model to the teacher. So here, I wanted to just put out a little bit of additional information. You see the 3 C's in the top left-hand corner, but I have consulting in red, and then I have a lot of what I just covered on those slides to the right side in the yellow box. Providing advice without explaining the underlying rationale curtails a teacher's ability to transfer new learning to personal context or to generate solutions independently. This is why we must be transparent, like I mentioned before, with our thinking to support the thinking process for solving a problem or generating ideas for improvement. Ideally, we hope that teachers needing the consultation will begin to mock the thinking process that you model. We may distinguish learning-focused consultation from simply fixing things or telling teachers what to do. As we move forward, looking at feedback, these three types of conversations on hold, we will revisit as part of the teacher-led conversation. We will come back to this. But here it's just as a part of the consulting we want to provide, but we don't want to fix things and tell too much. We really want them to still be a part of the problem-solving process. So I hope that makes sense. So I would ask you, what type of conversation do you have most? Do you have the coaching conversation, the collaborating conversations, or the consulting conversations? And if you want to just put your answers in the questions bar and send them in, we'll try to get some responses to see if one outweighs the others as far as what you feel like you're doing currently during your post-observations and summative conversations. I see a couple of collaborating and consulting. Okay. Okay. Looks like most of you are having collaborating conversations, but I'm sure that we have some coaching conversations with some teachers. We have collaborating conversations with some teachers, and we continue to have consulting conversations with some of the teachers in our building. So I think that overall you probably have different levels of performance by teachers, and therefore that would require a different C of the feedback conversation. So thank you for your feedback. What we do know, based on all the research that we have conducted ourselves and what that we have read to pull in to develop this presentation, we do know that teachers want and deserve feedback. So we need to make sure that they get the feedback so that they can build their leadership and instructional capacity. So here, what do we know regarding effective feedback? We know that feedback is not about the person giving it. It is about the person receiving, the teacher. Feedback is more effective the sooner it is given, and we have a 10-day span that is our state school board policy that we make sure we give our feedback during our post-observation conversations within 5 days, I think, of the observation, but we do have a time limit, and that is the reason why. Feedback is about the future, and I like this statement because usually when I think about feedback, it's about me giving feedback on what just happened, when really a good feedback conversation takes into consideration what happened, but really is about planning for the future and what we'll be doing to change moving forward. Also, feedback is about behavior, not morale or attitude, and sometimes it's difficult as principals to separate these, but in best practice, that's what we want to always strive to do. And then feedback is a sign of strong leadership. And I want to put a couple of stars beside of that one because it really is. It requires a lot of bravery to give good, helpful feedback to those needing it. Novice teachers tend to seek and respond to feedback, which acts to increase their commitment to the task. I just wanted to put that in there, that our novice, our new teachers, they seek and respond to this feedback, and it really increases their commitment to whatever they're doing, or increases their commitment to their grade level, their PLC, to the school. But that is important. So I wanted to include this slide because I also thought it was important that you know about where some of the research comes from that we used for this presentation. And a lot of the research for today is from SREB, Educator Effectiveness, and it stemmed from an article called Better Feedback and Better Outcomes. And I won't review all of this visual, but I did want to put a red arrow that pointed to the strategy 1, which is to encourage the teacher-led dialogue. And SREB is very familiar with our evaluation process and with how we do business in North Carolina, which is not unlike evaluation systems and processes in other states that are members of the SREB group. So to hear that we need to encourage the teacher-led dialogue, and we have been working on this a bit beginning last year, it tells me that we are moving in the right direction as we build our capacity as leaders and know that we need to coach better teachers to get better student outcomes. So to foster a climate of autonomous, self-reflective colleagueship, principals must enable teachers to be primarily responsible for judging the success of their own work. Teachers are their own toughest critics, and we know this. A mentor interviewed by SREB underscored the importance of giving teachers the opportunity to reflect before offering them feedback. And he was quoted, "By listening, you hear what teachers need most." And that's such an important quote. You may see it a couple of more times during the presentation. But the teachers interviewed indicated that the feedback they find helpful is concrete and specific. They want an idea for change that they can remember and implement. A teacher also said that ideally, the principal and teacher would create an actionable plan together. And another teacher wished her feedback conversation had been more interactive. She had more insights about next steps than she felt comfortable sharing. The principal's expertise and access to resources in combination with the teacher's firsthand knowledge of her context, her challenges, and her strengths provide the information necessary to best identify next steps. So to summarize some of what I just shared with you, the principal brings the resources and the access to the expertise. But the teacher, she is the expert on what's actually happening in her class, the context, the challenges, and the strengths of her students and of her delivery. Ladies, do we have any questions?
Not at this time.
Thank you. So moving along to the self-initiated action. The more the change process is self-defined, self-monitored, self-evaluated, and self-reinforced by those who have to make the changes, the greater the likelihood of enduring effects. So what this says to me is if the teacher is the one defining, monitoring, evaluating, and reinforcing, they are the ones that will ensure that the change happens for the greater good. Now moving to teacher-led observation and evaluation conversations. We have 4 bullet points just to discuss here. Good teacher-led observations and evaluation conversations meets the teacher where they are. Remember, the goal is growth. Also, transparent process for the post-observation and summative evaluation conversations. So what does this mean? This means that our teachers need to know what to expect from the post-observation and summative evaluation conversations. It shouldn't be a guessing game or a surprise on how this process works, and it really needs to be safeguarded and honored because it is very important for the growth of your teachers. Also, the use of the PDP, this removes uncertainty. If I have a professional development plan as a teacher, I clearly understand what is expected of me and how I will be judged on my progress and my growth for that year based on my professional development plan and my goals that I've identified and shared with my principal, or maybe my principal helped me develop. Also, clear feedback connections to the standards and elements using the language of the observation and evaluation rubric. And we'll talk a bit more about this as we move forward. So let's look at Standard 1, Element A, Teachers Lead in the Classroom. And let's consider a scenario where you are observing Mrs. Eldrith during a classroom observation and notice that a group of young ladies are not paying attention, nor are they engaging in the conversation or activities of the class. The teacher doesn't address the young ladies or their disruption to the class learning. When discussing your observation with the teacher, you might choose to describe what you observed, then relate directly back to the rubric. For example, I noticed 3 young ladies sitting in the back row. They were not paying attention and did not engage in the conversation or activities of the class. How do you ensure a safe and orderly classroom? How did you evaluate their progress during the lesson? How do you know the students are progressing? So those are just some questions that you could ask to probe a response from the teacher. Whenever possible, use the language of the rubric when providing feedback, and this creates clarity and is more concrete for the teachers. So here is a resource that is linked in your, again, I mentioned it earlier, linked in the handout section of your webinar. Questions for post-observation conference and summative evaluation. And the questions that I just read from the previous slide, one of those came directly from this resource. These questions are created by each element and uses the language of the rubric to lead engaging, coaching, feedback conversations. It also serves as a tool to understand the intent of the elements with fidelity. And this is provided again in the handout section of the presentation. So some of your responses were about time at the very beginning on why we don't have these rich conversations, or why we avoid conversations during the post-observation conference and the summative evaluation. So this really should cut down on some of your time. This gives you relative questions depending on what you observed during the classroom observation. You can ask these questions that really use the language and gets at what's really meant by the specific standard and element during the evaluation. So we're also providing a link to this document, and if you haven't used it or if you haven't seen it before, please do so and share with as many as your colleagues as possible. It's posted on the NACES Wiki, and so anyone has access to it. Sometimes I will encourage principals to hand this out to their teachers, to provide it to them so that they, again, understand what the standards and the elements are really asking for. But also, if a teacher shows up to the post-observation conference or the summative evaluation and they're prepared by answering all these questions, then you've won already. You are ahead of the game. If they've gone through that kind of reflection and prepared with responses for each of these questions, then that's a great thing. So moving on, encourage teacher-led dialogue and reflections during debriefing. This chart gives us an opportunity to see where we have been with our old practice, where we are now in our current practice, and how looking forward we have an opportunity to evolve our practice into richer conversations to build instructional capacity for teachers, thus again impacting student achievement. So let's begin by looking at old practice. And that was kind of like the scenario that I described earlier in the presentation today. Observes teachers and rates their performance. Progressing over to what I hope is our current practice for today in most schools across North Carolina, we provide evidence and rationale for those performance ratings. But moving forward to our evolved practice, we need to move in the direction of asking teachers to identify and share examples of the impact of their instruction on student behavior, student learning, and behavior. So that's a way to turn the conversation back over to the teacher by using this question, asking the teacher to identify and share examples. That's how we would do that. Let's look back at the old practice for the second. Ask teachers if they agree or disagree with the ratings. Current practice sets aside time for teachers to provide input on the feedback given. But moving forward, prepares targeted questions to probe for teachers' insights and promote self-reflection. Those targeted questions mentioned there, that could be the document, the resource document of questions that I just discussed, and we have given you a link to, and is also in our handout section. The last practice pinpoints areas teachers should work on to improve their craft. Our current expectation works with teachers to develop or revise their professional learning plans. And moving forward, our evolve practice reviews teachers' current professional learning plans and recommends aligned resources. Collaborates with teachers to revise plans to include action steps and follow-up opportunities. Again, this is how we would evolve into that greater support of feedback. So challenges for teacher-led dialogue. Some of the, and here, I think the first one, skill, was mentioned in our feedback with the scenario at the beginning. Someone texted in about not having the content knowledge, but that is a challenge. Principals may have gaps in content knowledge that prevent them from effectively helping teachers. So a solution here may be work more with your coaches that you have at your schools if you can, or if you're a small LEA and you don't have coaches within your school, look to your curriculum directors at your LEA to build capacity for your knowledge. Ask to co-observe. If you're a new principal and there is another principal from another school that may be mentoring you, if you could go in and watch some lessons together, they may be able to help you with understanding the content knowledge. Also, principals may be uncomfortable providing critical feedback in such a direct form, and we are all uncomfortable providing critical feedback because in most cases, not all, but in most cases, I feel like in North Carolina, our teachers are trying to do their best, and they are working hard, and they want to do well. And so it is a bit uncomfortable when you are providing critical feedback in this form. However, it is necessary. Our teachers, even our best teachers, need critical feedback to always work to improve their practice. Time is another challenge. Principals may find that customizing probes and resources and resource recommendations require more effort than current practices. And I agree with that, but hopefully you have resources available to you, or you have a toolbox of resources that you know works. Maybe it's a program you're implementing in your school, but you have these things to provide to the teacher. And when we think about customizing, that again may be a place where we want to reach out to some of our specialists or some of our coaches on our campus to help us with that. Role uncertainty. Teachers may struggle with taking on a more active role during debriefing meetings. And that's really what this webinar is about. It's how we're trying to shift the responsibility of that conversation from being principal-led to being teacher-led. And yes, some teachers may struggle with this, but we're going to give you some tools that will support the process if you decide that you do want to start moving towards a more teacher-led and teacher-directed role during post-observation conversations and summative evaluations. Also, follow-through. Teachers and principals may not hold each other accountable to complete or revisit the action plans. And I will say this to a principal or to a teacher, but mostly to my principal colleagues, I would say if you do not plan to follow through, then do not take the risk of having the conversation or trying to make the change to begin with. All that says is that you needed to be heard. It doesn't say that you are interested in the actual change process and the improvement. So follow through is critical. Moving along, threats to teachers and feedback conversations. This is some of the most interesting research that SREB identified. These threats experienced by teachers and feedback conversations. So let's discuss these 4 things that seem to unsettle teachers regarding their feedback. Teachers are fearful that the evaluations are based on a thin slice, like just the time that you were in their room observing them. And that is not the case. When you are completing an observation or the evaluation at the end of the year, it should be based on lots of different times when you have observed the teacher. Maybe you have additional walkthrough data or things that you remember seeing during walkthroughs. So it's not about a thin slice. Now the observation, it can be about that time that you were in the classroom, but it also spreads out to be during this observation time as well. It's what you see and what you know about the teacher. Now, here I want to make sure you're aware it's only what happened during this school year when you are completing the observation. Our evaluations in North Carolina are annual evaluations. So a teacher's performance from last year or something that you witnessed them doing last year, we do not take that into consideration when we are completing the observation for this year. So remember that when completing the rubric. Also, unclear expectations. And so in digging a little bit deeper, this connects back with some of the information that I shared earlier, and that is if we can take away the fear of the not knowing what to expect during our feedback conversations, then we provide support for the teacher, and this removes a threat to them. So having clear expectations of what to expect during that post-observation conversation is crucial. And we're going to look at a framework that you can use and tweak to make it your own. A sense of disempowerment to teachers during feedback conversations, and an absence of helpful information. Teachers are fearful that they're just going to hear what needs to change and they're not going to receive helpful information on how to make that change for improvement. So I would challenge you to consider how you can remove these threats from your post-observation conversations. So moving on, utilize evidence. This is a great way to support teachers, and especially regarding feedback. Talk about the behavior, not about the attitude or motivation. But the second bullet I really want to pay close attention to, because some of you may not have heard this, this expression before, of low inference. Reference low inference evidence. So what is low inference evidence? It's anything you can see or hear, it's factual, and it removes your bias and interpretations. You're not making a judgment call. Low inference data or low inference evidence is factual, can be seen, can be heard. Now I know on this next slide we can't see this classroom. We're not there. We can't hear this classroom, but just based on what we're looking for, there is a lot here that we could infer. For example, we could say that the teacher in this picture is creative, energetic, or fun. However, we don't know for sure that that is the case. It could be that the students in this picture just woke up from their nap and are taking a stretch break. And remember, attitude and motivation don't matter in this regard, but creative and energetic and fun are describing the teacher's attitude and motivation, and really are not things that we can actually see or hear. You can't see or hear energetic. So I'd like for you to look and think to yourself, name some, or jot them down if you'd like, name the low inference evidences that you see from this picture. What are some low inference evidence that you can see from this picture? What do you actually know? I'll give you about 30 more seconds. So we can see that students have their arms raised. The teacher is standing with the students. The teacher is smiling and talking or singing. The students are standing. There are posters on the wall. The chart paper is blank. Those are all low inference data. When giving teachers feedback, use low inference evidence collected from the classroom observation or campus interactions and aligned to the bullets in the rubric. But let's look here at some more low inference data. For example, I think that the students are modeling the teacher's behavior. I can also identify that, well, 7 of 11 students are modeling the teacher's following the teacher's lead or modeling the teacher's behavior. And I see lots of things on the walls, but I would have to investigate a little bit closer to ensure that the materials are relevant, timely, and appropriate. So in order to remove the bias or prejudice, I would need to collect low inference data here. So this is just a picture for some conversation, just something for you to think about. In what we see and what we think may be happening, but what could actually be happening. Ladies, do we have any questions?
Not at this time.
Thank you. So, critical attributes of feedback. Research has provided some critical attributes of feedback for us to remember and follow. Scaffold listening strategies to foster and improve conversations. This includes asking the right question. We have provided you with a questions document for school executives. So again, there you have the questions document to use. Sequence the conversation into a predictable format. Clarifying expectations and improving the teacher's ability to predict the process and results of a feedback conversation have the potential to lessen the level of anxiety and helplessness that a teacher may feel. So having a protocol that you follow can be very beneficial to how well the feedback conversation progresses. Also, address the teacher's concerns. Remember that they are the expert in their classroom. No one knows the context of their classroom as well as the teacher. And then most importantly, co-develop the next steps, the process moving forward. Even for the distinguished teacher, always have next steps for improvement. So we've covered a lot of information about feedback, and here let's put it all together. And this is the teacher-led conference framework that I've mentioned. It's a modified version of the feedback conversation protocol provided by the Carnegie Foundation. Protocols within a framework are helpful by explicitly reminding users of the minimum steps necessary to ensure quality. While protocols can be criticized as overly prescriptive or overly specific, getting the steps right is hard, even when you know what they are. But a protocol like the one that you see here on the screen can cut through the noise surrounding feedback conversations. And let me repeat this. A protocol like this one on the screen can cut through the noise surrounding feedback conversations. And examples of noise that might get in the way of an effective feedback conversation would be new expectations for the principals or teachers, or the anxiety about the judgment, the unclear intentions, the high stakes. But instead, this framework serves as a grounding resource to help principals and teachers, or coaches and teachers, to navigate the conversation and achieve its aim. So let's look at this framework. It begins with a warm and clear opening. That's starting from the very beginning of the conversation. But when you have a warm and clear opening, and yes, that would fall to the responsibility of the principal to ensure that this happens, but immediately you want to empower the teacher to start the beginning of the conversation. And that would start with teachers reviewing the aim of the lesson observed, and then the teacher articulating her aim for the feedback conversation. And then it would be the principal's turn. The principal paraphrases and affirms the teacher's aim of the lesson and aim for the conversation. And then the principal similarly states her or his aim for the conversation. So that's how our teacher-led conversations would begin. And then moving to letter B, focus on the positive. Teacher discusses what they thought went well, and then the principal paraphrases the teacher's reflection, then comments on concrete, specific things that went well during the observation. So start with an affirmation of what is working. Start on a positive note, affirming for teachers that the conversation will be focused on supporting them to become better teachers and to help clarify that they are not at risk of being terminated. Remember, to foster a climate of autonomous, self-reflective colleagueship, principals must enable the teacher to be the primarily responsible for judging the success of their own work. Teachers are their toughest critics. And then you see we move on to C, which is identify challenges and feedback, and D, teacher and principals generate next steps. And we'll go to the next slide to look closer at this. Because this, where C and D is located, this is where you make the difference. This is like the sweet spot of the evaluation. On C, you're identifying challenges and feedback. The teacher gets to do that first. And most of the time, what I'm finding in having conversations with principals, most of the time, the very things you have a concern about, the teacher's going to mention during this time. And it's much easier if they identify the challenge and for you to just work with them in a coaching way or collaborating way, and even a consulting way, work with what they've brought to the table. And then, of course, it's your turn, if they don't, for you to bring the challenges to be discussed between you and the teacher. But when you're doing that, make sure you remember concrete and specific ideas for change. If you saw something you didn't like, or if you noted something you didn't like, you've used some of a question from the resource document, but then you also want to make sure that it's in a context of concrete and specific ideas for change. And then progressing on to D, which the teacher and principal generate next steps from improvement. And this is our planning forward. And remember, if you just take away one thing, feedback is about the future. So planning forward for letter D. And the principal brings their expertise and access to the resources to these steps for improvement, and the teacher brings their firsthand knowledge of the content, context, challenges, and strengths, and together developing the next steps for improvement. So a checklist for this process is in the handout section of the webinar. Remember to make this process your own. I mean, I have it, and I'll flip back to the, well, maybe I will go back to the screen beforehand. This is what you'll see, a checklist somewhat, but consider sharing the checklist or one like it with teachers. Remember that one of the greatest threats felt by a teacher is the unclear expectations. So if you provide them this format and they know what to expect, that's good for them, and it's good for you as well. But you can change this to make it what you need for it to be. Maybe simplify it or add more detail. That would be up to you, or change it altogether. We want you to find what works best for you. So I told you might see that this slide again, and because I think it's so important, principals must enable teachers to be primarily responsible for judging the success of their own work. By listening, you hear what teachers need most. So that concludes our webinar for today. Do we have any thoughts, questions, or ponderings? While some of you may be thinking, or some of the ladies may be preparing a question to share, I'll go ahead and share with you that upcoming webinars next Tuesday on April 17th, we'll be taking a look at Standard 5 of the Executive Standards, Managerial Leadership. Tuesday, May 1st, we'll be looking at Standards 6 and 7 from the School Executive Standards. And on the 8th, May 8th, we'll look at the teacher and support staff end of the year process, and that will be with Cammie Nairn. And on the 15th, we'll look at the administrator end of the year process on May 15th. Yes. So any questions, ladies? It's been a quiet group.
There are no questions at this time.